Hello, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 45. We are getting right into it today with our first question from Lisa from Finland, who says, is there a biological basis for why some people are more religious than others?
Well, nicely, that's an easy one, which is yes, there's a biological basis because there's a biological basis to everything. Okay, is there a biological basis to this interesting facet of human behavior? Yes, because of everything that's interesting about humans. So, what I'm dancing around here is getting to the actual question because I'm concerned that I'm not going to be able to go about 10 seconds without offending somebody out here with considering religiosity, the capacity for it, um, in the context of biology. First off, something that makes this an immensely complicated question is we are not doing a homogeneous comparison of religious people and non-religious people. Even non-religious people, even atheists, come in all sorts of different flavors. You have emotionally driven grounds for atheism, sort of cognitively driven. You have people who really don't care either way. Is there a God? Nah, whatever, apatheists. And when we get to the religious side of it, incredible heterogeneity simply because, depending on your calculation, there's 5, 6, 7,000 different religious traditions on earth. So a broad comparison between people who are more or less religious in a biological context has to be done in this setting of tremendous heterogeneity. So that said, it seems like there's some broad axes that differentiate more and less religious people, which map on to some biology that we know. First domain is one related to sort of the very cognitive aspects of religious belief. And essentially, it comes down to how dependent are you for clearly seeing cause and effect? How dependent are you for knowing whether correlation is causal? Okay, here's a great example of this, and this is from classic research done by B.F. Skinner and behaviorism back when, which has a word which is not meant to be snarky, which we'll get to in a while. But you take a pigeon. You take a pigeon, which was his favorite study subject, and you don't feed them for a while, so they're nice and hungry, and you put them in their cage, and suddenly, randomly, with no warning, you drop a piece of food right into the middle of the cage, what they've been looking for. And the pigeon is delighted, the pigeon eats it, and also cognitively, because even pigeons have this human like need for attribution, the pigeon is thinking, wait, what did I just do that made that piece of food appear? What did I do to cause that manna to drop from heaven? And the pigeon sort of develops various theories and it's sitting around there and it's still hungry. And you drop another pellet in, and the pigeon happens to be in the same corner of the cage as for the first one, or happened to have its left foot wing up in the air rather than its right one. And the pigeon has attribution. The pigeon says, aha, I know what caused that pellet of food to be dropped in here, by doing this. And what you see is after a while, you come in and the pigeon is repeatedly doing this behavior, which it has been conditioned to believe has a causal effect on the delivery of the food. And the term that Skinner gave for it was what is the loaded term, was he called this superstitious conditioning. And this is basically how much are you demanding a difference between correlation and causality? Are you prone towards deciding because you did this or you said the proper words, whatever, you won in the lottery or the pellet of food dropped in or anything of that sort? And what was then shown subsequently, conditioning pigeons, conditioning rats, get superstitious conditioning, building around this drive and all sorts of beasties out there, including us, to see attribution, was something randomly good happens, something randomly bad happens, and you were looking for where was the causality very readily turning into what did I do to cause that to happen? And subsequent research showed that superstitious conditioning was heavily dependent on the hippocampus. If you damaged the hippocampus, pigeons, rats, etc., became more vulnerable to superstitious conditioning, which is to say they had a harder time doing what we would call critical thinking in our kids, a harder time saying, wait a second, did that actually cause that? Let's see, let me see if every time I do that, does that happen? Does that ever happen when I haven't done that? How reliably linked are they? You damage the hippocampus and you are less dependent on seeing a clear linkage between the two events. So, am I saying more religious people have hippocampal damage? No, we're not saying that. That's one of the parameters, how important cause and effect is in your mind. Another domain, a completely different domain of religiosity, transcendence, awe, gratitude. How readily do you look at the world around you and you glory in its size and you glory in your insignificance in it and you feel part of something way bigger than yourself? And that's a building block of another type of religiosity. And I think in previous episodes, we've talked about some of the science these days about awe and its linkage to gratitude. This is wonderful work by Dacher Keltner at UC Berkeley. And one of the things that's come out of that literature is there's another brain system, something called the default mode network. We've discussed it previously. It has to do with daydreaming. It has to do with mind wandering. One component of this circuitry has to do with autobiographical reflection. You're thinking about yourself, you're thinking about where you came from. And an interesting finding in that field is less activity in that autobiographical part of this network, more easy for you to feel a sense of awe, a sense of gratitude, more easy to forget about you and your parameter and just, man, I am a speck in the universe. So that's got something to do with it. Other domains, religiosity is often about sociality, how much of a need people have for that, and there's an underlying biology to that. How much of a need do people have for repetition, structured repetition in their lives, ritualistic, and I can't remember if we've talked about it, but I will be easily prompted to talk about it at length. There is a link between people with obsessive compulsive disorder and people with highly ritualistic aspects of religious belief because there's an overlap and they're built around how much comfort do you get from structured repetition. Now, all that brings us to the axis that I think is most important of all in terms of making sense of who becomes religious, who's not, what's the underlying biology, which is how discomfited are you? How stressed are you? How diseased are you by uncertainty, ambiguity, novelty? Because if there's nothing else out there, the core of what life is about is some hugely looming, ambiguous issues of like, well, how long am I going to last? How long are my loved ones going to, what happens afterward? All of those. And if you have a big temperamental, big affective, big cognitive difference in how comfortable, how capable you are of dealing with ambiguity, the unknown, that's going to be a big predictor as well. And what this is tapping into is, on a certain level, how prone are you towards anxiety? Anxiety being a very different thing from fear. Fear is about specificity. Fear is about something, some outcome that would be highly aversive. And the key thing about it is subject to feedback. Oh, that didn't happen. You can stop fearing that. What anxiety is about instead is non-specificity, and fear of the unknown is description of what anxiety, if novelty, if the future is a scary place, if any of those things are the case, you are being set up for a non-specific sense of dis-ease, which is what anxiety is about. And I know I have sardonically in previous one said something to the effect of, and religious belief is very good for decreasing anxiety because it gives you answers to the unknown. It gives you answers to the unanswerable, the ambiguous, the snarky comment there being, nonetheless, very often the types of anxieties that religion is good at decreasing are anxieties that religion invented in the first place. Nonetheless, we've got a contrast here between anxiety and fear. And nicely, there's a strong neurobiological dichotomy between those as well. Lots of you by now will guess that fear is all anchored in the amygdala. The amygdala is about fear and conditioned fear and fear, both phobias, fears you don't have to learn, ingrained aversions, as well as learned fears, are very centrally located in the amygdala. And the most interesting sort of realm of that is learned fears. When you learn you are afraid of those people, when you learn you are afraid of that bell because here comes a shock, that involves a part of the amygdala, two subregions of it called the basal amygdala and the lateral amygdala, which are like primitive honorary cortex. They're structurally very fancy. They're good for learning. They are good for learning the parameters of this new scary thing. They are good for fear conditioning. And what they're really good for is not only learning the thing to be afraid of, but the context for it. And interestingly, when you are learning to be afraid of big, complicated things, these parts of the amygdala even lasso in the hippocampus to play a role in learning context. There's this great hierarchical relationship there. Suppose somebody robs you by pointing a gun at you in a dark alley in the middle of the night in a bad part of the neighborhood, and you come away with that having a very visceral, very central amygdala response to a gun pointing in your face. What's the context in which that happened? Well, on a very local level, the context is having been in the dark alley. On a more distal level, the context is having been in a bad, scary neighborhood. And what you see is the other parts of the amygdala, this basolateral region, is responsible for the most proximal bit of context. Remember, alleys like that are scary. The hippocampus gets roped in to remembering the more sort of global. And remember, that neighborhood is scary as well, sort of a hierarchy of that. Okay, so that is all about our world of fear, a very specific source of disease and a very specific resolution to it when it turns out there was nothing to be afraid of. You are capable of turning it off, and the frontal cortex has a big role in figuring out, ooh, the scary thing didn't really happen. Let's tell these parts of the amygdala to quiet down. So we have that contrast with the very non-specific disease of anxiety. It's just there. It's just permeating. There's nothing that makes it turn off. And that's mostly the realm of a part of the brain that people now classify as part of the extended amygdala, the amygdala suburbs, this brain region called the bed nucleus of the striae terminalis. And that appears to be more about anxiety, non-specific, than about the specificity of fear. What are some of the things you see with that? The pattern of neurons in this bed nucleus of the striae terminalis, the pattern of neuron excitation is much less specific, much more what anxiety is about, rather than spiky fear. Its structure is not like the fancy parts of the amygdala. It doesn't talk to the hippocampus. It's not capable of remembering every feature of that person's face. It's just muddy nonsense. It slowly activates the sort of things that could quiet down the amygdala, don't quiet down this bed nucleus. It's about the non-specific anxiety. So clearly what we're heading to is people differ as to how much anxious, non-specific dis-ease they were feeling about the world. And in that regard, religion is often very good for decreasing such anxieties. Now, it strikes me recently, religion is doing something very interesting about the difference between anxiety and fear. One of the things that religiosity does very nicely, as I said, is quell anxiety, quell that non-specific dis-ease of what does the future hold, and that realm of just it has no start, it has no ending, it has no shape to it. And rather than erasing all those types of disease, it strikes me what religion is often doing is replacing anxiety with fear. Because what it does is it gives you instructions. It takes this inchoate, misty, corrosive lack of knowing, and it gives you care and feeding instructions of the boogeyman. Say this many times, do this, don't do these 17 things, only do this on these days, and do it while you've got your wing up this way, and it'll be okay. And if you do that, things will be okay. What religiosity is often about is transitioning you from the murkiness of anxiety to the specificity of fear, which is coming with an instruction manual. Okay, that should be great, and that is great for a lot of people because their religiosity can then take the form of, I know if I do these things, everything is going to be fine, which anxiety can never lead to the answer of, it's going to be okay, you're going to be okay. That's what a specific fear is about. But this is what has struck me as interesting. Religion has this loophole in it that the instructions for feeding and care and how many cups of kibble you give to Beelzebub, the instructions come with some non-specificity. So it'll say, okay, you need to do this 7 times and you need to repeat it this way and you need to do this and here's these ritualistic things, but make sure you pay attention. Make sure you really mean it. Make sure you love God enough. Make sure all of this non-specificity in there that could allow you to go through the care and feeding instructions and can default you back into the, but I didn't do it enough. I didn't focus on it enough. And all the major religions have these loopholes. Islam, Muhammad said something like, if you don't pay attention when you say your prayers, they don't count. Christianity had this concept of scrupulosity in the old knowledge of the old version of it, which is you need to pay attention. You can't do stuff like rote. If you do your religious stuff just by rote, it doesn't count. In Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, when you were reading from the Torah, you were supposed to hold this pointer thing and hold it as you're going along and reading it so that you don't inadvertently just do it by memory, do it by rote, because if you're not really thinking about it, if you're not really focusing, it doesn't count as much. So it's this loophole here where you think you've got all the instructions in there, but there's ambiguities in the instruction manual. Make sure you really mean it. Make sure you are thinking closely enough about it. Make sure you are loving God enough. What I think that is a loophole for dumping you back into the non-specific anxiety, which makes the structure of religion so protective until it loops you back again. Anyway, I've been thinking about that recently. So, what makes people more or less prone towards religiosity? How much your hippocampus is demanding cause and effect? How mired your default mode network is in thinking about yourself rather than disconnecting and seeing yourself as a speck in the entire world, how much comfort you get from repetition, from answers, how much you are prone towards anxiety. Where are these things coming from? All the usual suspects. There are genetic contributions, not causes. There are aspects of early experience, early environment, beginning prenatally, what sort of parental values, what the culture is in the neighborhood, your peer group, all the usual stuff as to how much of a need you're going to have for any of these axes to take you in a direction where religiosity is going to be a form of comfort for you.
All right, next, Evan from North Carolina says, how does insulin resistance develop in type 2 diabetes? Are insulin receptors being inappropriately downregulated, or are other players in the signaling pathway going awry? Do we understand the mechanisms behind why obesity seems to increase the risk of developing this condition?
Well, this is a mighty important question given the pandemic, the waves of cases of insulin resistance sweeping across our planet. Okay, how does it work? And basically, exactly as the question outlined. Insulin. So your body's cells like to run on glucose, not solely, but it's one of the main energy sources. Glucose. Where do you get it from? You get it from your diet, not just in the form of glucose, but other molecules are broken down, converted into glucose in your gut, dumped in your bloodstream, and you now have circulating glucose, circulating sugar levels. And the goal now is to get the circulating glucose into target cells throughout your body to feed them so they can do their thing, and especially to be good at putting it into the cells that are working particularly hard at a time. Any case, so you need some sort of signal that will tell cells to take up glucose out of the circulation. And that signal is insulin. Insulin, it's a hormone. It comes out of your pancreas. It comes out as a result of a glucostat monitor in your pancreas. Your pancreas is measuring the amount of glucose in the bloodstream. Eat a big meal, levels of glucose go up, detected by the pancreas, and that's a signal to secrete insulin. Insulin in the bloodstream, what it then does is it binds to insulin receptors on cells throughout your body. And as a result of that binding, those cells pump in more glucose and your cells get fed. Terrific. So that's how it works. Insulin, in response to elevated glucose in the bloodstream, a metabolic signal, a totally logical one, secrete insulin, it does its thing. One interesting additional ripple, which is if every single evening you eat at 6 o'clock, around 5:45, you begin to start to secrete insulin. Whoa, your blood glucose levels are not rising yet because you're not eating yet. It's anticipation of your nervous system, in particular, parasympathetic nervous system, can be conditioned to secrete insulin in anticipation of food coming. So that is very cool. So in either case, this is what insulin does. What if you have a disease where you don't have insulin? This is type 1 diabetes, juvenile diabetes. Not what the question was about. Type 1 is about this problem, autoimmune chaos in your pancreas. You wipe out the beta cells that secrete insulin. You got no insulin. How do you get in trouble now? Because you have no means of getting circulating glucose to your cells throughout your body, and they're starving. You get into trouble in that way. And what's the solution? Give someone replacement insulin. Insulin injections, that serves as replacing the missing insulin. So you give somebody some insulin and that solves the problem. And your cells don't starve. How about what we call insulin resistant diabetes, type 2 diabetes, which is what the question was focusing on? Very different scenario. Suppose you've had enough food, you've had enough nutrients, you've had so much that every single storage cell in your body is chock full of stored energy, like you put on weight. You put on weight, suppose you have become more sedentary, you've gotten older, more of a tendency to put on weight. Suppose you've put on a lot of weight. Suppose your storage cells, in particular your fat cells, are filled up with everything. And what the cells essentially have is a ceiling. At some point, they have stored all the glucose they can, usually in a variety of different types of storage forms. At some point, they are completely full. And what your cells say, in effect, is that's it. We're full. We're not taking up any more circulating glucose. We got no more room here. We're full up. I don't care how much insulin there is. We're not going to listen to insulin anymore. Your target cells become resistant to insulin because they're totally full and they can't take any more. What's the mechanism for this? Exactly what was posited before, which is the number of insulin receptors decrease. You down regulate the numbers of them. And there's a mechanism by which fat stores inside, say, a fat cell will signal up to the insulin receptor molecule and yank it off there. And it's all very effective and terrific. So you've put on a lot of weight. Your cells are full of energy. They stop listening to insulin. So why do you get into trouble? Is because your cells don't have energy now? Obviously not. You're getting insulin resistant in the first place because your cells have so much energy. That's not the problem. It's a completely different problem than in juvenile diabetes. The problem is you got all this glucose now in your bloodstream, and it's not being taken up by glucose transporters and target cells because the insulin receptors have downregulated. They're not listening to insulin, insulin resistant. You got all this glucose in your bloodstream just circulating around and looking for trouble. What do elevated levels of glucose in the bloodstream do to cause trouble? They glom up your arteries. They help to make inflammatory plaques get even plackier. There's this whole process in biochemistry called non-enzymatic addition. Glucose molecules can just start sticking to stuff if there's enough of them, and they're around long enough of a time, and they start sticking to stuff, and a piece of glucose will stick to this piece of protein, which isn't supposed to happen, and then it will stick to this piece of protein, and they're kind of glommed up together, and you can get layers of them. What's that about? That's one of the side effects of sort of uncontrolled hyperglycemia and diabetes. You get cataracts in your eyes. You begin to get filmy crystals of proteins that are getting, you know, hairball together by, Velcro of glucose because there's so much of it sticking together. Glucose, this non-enzymatic addition of glucose to blood vessels and clogging them up, that's where you get into trouble. So you've got two very different pictures. Juvenile diabetes, you don't have the insulin. Your cells are starving because they can't take up, they don't have the uptake signal from insulin. Take some insulin and take it up and off you go. Adult onset insulin resistance, you've put on so much weight, the cells are so full, they stop listening to insulin. The cells are fine because they got plenty of energy, but glucose circulating around and it gets you into trouble. It clogs up your kidneys. You get a diabetic neuropathy, which is to say that you got some chronic pain things that arise from that. You get into trouble. One final piece of it. Where does stress fit into this? And this is where you've got a very interesting interaction between stress and insulin resistant diabetes. Stress. What is stress about? If you're a normal mammal, there's a physical emergency, you're running for your life, somebody's trying to eat you, you're trying to eat somebody else, you need energy right now for your exercising muscles. And what is one of the stupidest things to do with your circulating energy while you're stressed and running for your life? Store it away in your fat cells for next spring, store it for some long-term building project. The logic of the short-term stress response is you block energy storage. You're emptying out your energy stores to use right now for this emergency. So, what if you were stressed not because somebody's chasing you for 30 seconds, but because you were psychologically stressed around the clock nonstop for years, decades on end? What are you over and over telling your body with these stress hormones like glucocorticoids? It's saying, don't store. Don't store glucose. Don't store because we're about to run for our lives. We need it. Don't listen to insulin. What lots of stress and stress hormones like glucocorticoids do is they exacerbate insulin resistance. So you get someone who's just in the ballpark of a serious case of insulin resistance where they're going to get into type 2 diabetes and hyperglycemia because the glucose has no place to go. And what does chronic stress do? It says, what a great idea. Don't listen to insulin. Glucocorticoids and chronic stress worsen the downregulation, the dysfunction of insulin receptors. So that's where you get an interaction between the two.
And that is it for episode 45. Keep submitting questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of Science and the Beard.